I wanted to take an opportunity to do a bit of a land acknowledgement, as I am here from Vancouver and I'm on Coast Salish territory right now. So the lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. These land acknowledgements are becoming more and more a common practice in public engagement across different institutions. Where they're not always common is in some areas of our country here in Canada, especially in rural areas, and in some other places where they haven't become yet a real practice. But in places where they are common, they sometimes risk becoming a bit of something we do as a box we tick, and they kind of lose their meaning. And I wanted to take an opportunity to do a little bit of a reflection on this and why these are really important for us when we talk about equity and inclusion in public engagement. I put here a slide with some words by Indigenous scholar Chelsea Vowell, and I think these are important because they remind us that these land acknowledgements are a way to unsettle ourselves a little bit and to remind ourselves that oftentimes our engagements tend to erase the voices of Indigenous peoples, and this acknowledgement gives us an opportunity to center those voices in our engagements again. So I wanted to give us all a chance to maybe take a few seconds to reflect on the territories we are each on and what we know about the peoples of the lands that we dwell on right now. And as an example, land acknowledgements don't need to be very complicated. And people often ask me, how do I get started with this? And I say, you know, oftentimes just pick up your phone, call your local band office, call your local community and find out what is the best practice, how to do this, what are the words that are expected to be used, what are the types of protocols you can bring into your engagements. But this is something that's very important to us in our team to make sure we do these well and that they do carry meaning for us. And on the slide, I've shared a picture of the welcome figure that stands right at the bottom of our building at the SFU Vancouver campus, and it's a beautiful carved figure by local Musqueam artist Brent Sparrow. And as our academic director often reminds us, walking past this figure every morning when we get to the office reminds us of the importance of acknowledging the lands and the peoples of these lands. So with that, I'm going to just go over a few housekeeping things. So the session today is being recorded just so that we can provide the recording to folks who were not able to join us live today. When we get to the question and period, I will ask you to just remind yourself that it is being recorded, so please don't use any language your grandmother would not approve of. We will take a little 5-minute break around 11:15. So as we are all spending now a lot of time on Zoom and other means of electronic communication, we thought it was important to give everybody a little break to get some more tea, coffee, or just take a breath of fresh air outside their door. Again, if you're experiencing any technical issues, you can contact our technical host, Sabrina. Her email is on the slide, but you can also get in touch with her through the chat function of Zoom. As I mentioned, we will be doing 2 series of presentations, and then we will try to get to a large question and answer period. And for that, we will be using the question and answer function of Zoom. So at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a little icon that says Q&A, and that will open up a box where you can type in your questions, but you can also upvote questions posed by other participants. So that's also an opportunity to build on each other's questions. So we'll be using that in the later part of this webinar. As I mentioned also earlier, we have 2 wonderful ASL interpreters with us today. You will find them under the names ASL Jen and ASL Sharon in the list of participants. So if you require American Sign Language interpretation, we do recommend that you pin their video. So if you find their video in the long list of participants, you can click on the 3 little dots at the top right-hand corner of their video and select the pin video. That way you will have them on your screen at all times. And they will show up on normally on the right-hand side of your screen. They might be on top of a whole long list of videos. You can choose to just use one only video, and then you can also drag the corner of that video to make it a little bit larger. I see there's a raised hand somewhere. If you don't mind right now typing in your question in the chat function, and we'll get to you right away. The next function that we have today is we have closed caption provided. So again, Zoom does have a closed caption function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can click there to see the closed captions, or you can also access a full page stream at the following links. So the link that's on the screen right now, but it's also repeated in the chat box, and you can click directly on it. So folks who need a full page stream without the lag that sometimes happens on Zoom, you can access that as well. I will just check here. I think we have a question from Jerry. Jerry, can we get a copy of this presentation? Yes, we will send you a copy of the presentation as well as a link to download the document that we will be talking about today, and a recording of the webinar in the next few days. So thanks for asking, Jerry. Okay, so I think we can now get started on the actual content of this presentation, since we're all here and ready to go. And first of all, I will give you a quick overview of what happened with this research. About a year and a half ago, SFU's Maurice J. Waugh Center for Dialogue was commissioned by the International Association for Public Participation to write a research paper on inclusion in public engagement. And we went through a bit of a literature review, we did a couple of interviews, and we wrote the paper. And as we were doing this work, we realized there was so much more to this topic than what we could produce in this short paper. And fortunately, a thing that is quite rare in universities, we had access to a little bit of funding through an endowment we have at the center, and we were able to then conduct a full year of in-depth research that included literature reviews, focus groups, interviews, peer reviews, and produce the document that we will be talking about today. This was quite an endeavor for us. We rarely get the chance to do such an in-depth research at our center. And to talk a little bit about what that process was like, because the process was just as important as the outcome in this case, I would like to introduce my colleague, Grace Lee. Grace is the manager of our signature events and endowments. And as I mentioned, this research was made possible by a generous endowment of our center. And Grace was also very key in helping this process come to life and managing all the important relations that needed to be managed during this process. So Grace, I will pass it on to you to tell us a little bit about how this all happened and how all of this came to life.
Thank you, Elodie, and welcome everybody. So my name is Grace, and I'll be talking a little bit, before we delve into the principles, share with you a little bit a snapshot of the process itself and some questions that we had to work through for our own engagement process in creating these principles. At the center, we always had this question: how do we get out of reaching the same 10 people over and over again? And as all of you know, there is no recipe for inclusion. Public engagement process needs to respond and adapt. So earlier in the process, the team worked with International Association for Public Participation, as Elodie mentioned, to author a research paper on the principles of inclusive public engagement. So, and following the initial research, the center decided to fund further engagement to find community members who will directly comment and validate the principles with us. So as a team, we sat down and started to talk about what is the right way to approach this project. We had a lot of questions. Are we ready to engage in this topic? What should be the framing of different focus groups should be? Who should be the facilitators? Do we have an adequate pool of diverse facilitators to engage in this topic? And as an institution, are we ready to cede power and let diverse facilitators be the face of our project? How comfortable are we taking risks and knowing that the process won't be perfectly smooth when working with new partners? And what kind of accessibility needs should we consider? How do we ensure diversity? Who do we invite? And realistically, with a limited budget, what are the trade-offs? And these are just some of the questions that we had to work through before getting into the project. And this deep framing exercise taught us a lot and actually became a testing ground for the 8 principles that you'll hear in a minute. The Center's Indigenous Fellow and Associate Ginger Gosnell-Myers and Dr. Robert Dahm really helped us work through these questions of what inclusion means in an engagement process. After hours and hours of consultation and discussions, you won't be surprised, we came to the conclusion that we will never get it right. And I'm sorry if you came here today to get the answer to do inclusive engagement, because we didn't know what to do. And we found out that there will never be one answer in how we serve different needs and how we prioritize in inviting different communities of diversity. We also discussed that we needed real life cases on how different public engagement processes succeeded in engaging with diverse population, because we believe that without it, the principles would not be practical. Ultimately, we really wanted this process as a whole to increase the capacity of those of us doing this work. So after a few edits on the plan, we decided to convene 4 focus groups, and they were one with academic community, one with public institutions and government, and 2 with city-specific tables with mixed group of community members and service providers. Then we created a matrix of outcomes and questions we wanted answer from each specific audience. And they were, how do these groups assess current state of inclusion and accessibility in public engagement? How can we improve inclusion and accessibility? And what are the tools and resources that currently exist? We asked each group to identify challenges as convener or as a participant of a public engagement process and analyze what were some of the shared themes that existed across the group. At the final dialogue that brought together all these groups, we used case studies that we harvested in the focus groups to co-create the final principles. Sometimes, as Elodie said, framing a question and the process itself is as important as the outcome, as it defines the project. To create a sense of collaboration and nurture real relationships, you really need to spend a lot of time in the beginning to define the right questions you're trying to ask, and ask yourself whether you're ready to even engage on the topic. I see that in a lot of my projects, the community that is built during the process becomes the basis of engagement with diverse voices. It was a huge learning process for us to do this work in the back seat, knowing that the knowledge that we're producing and we will present to you is not entirely ours as an institution, and that it is the community's. Another point that I really wanted to talk to you today about is how we did outreach. From the beginning, it was really important for us to do this in a meaningful way and not to tokenize or just check a box. We all know that focusing on meaningful relationship is one way to get diversity and get good outcomes. And thankfully, I had the privilege in my current role of engaging very diverse communities on a wide range of topics. So I started to pick up my phone and call people and asked, who are the key people that needs to be involved in this discussion? If you're a practitioner joining today and have experience engaging with the public, I bet you have a lot of experiences of feeling insecure about a program that you're about to launch and feeling vulnerable, not knowing exactly how you should be convening. However, at the end, one of the ways that really diversified the participant group for this project was by being open about the process before it was public. I worked with partners from other projects and solicited their ideas on how this process can better accommodate the communities they serve. Then we asked our community partners to identify in their community those who were passionate about this topic and refer them or attend with someone from their organization as a pair. Other than that, we wanted someone with experience, directly or indirectly, in public engagement process. We left the criteria quite open without making it too prescribed. This really furthered our reach into the communities that we usually don't have access to, such as a newcomer who don't really have any institutional ties. And in some cases, this ended up providing accessibility to those who would not be able to attend. I really wanted to give a quick shout out to the Self Advocates program at Unity Semiahmoo House in Surrey. They are an organization that works to ensure people with intellectual and development disabilities hold the same rights and responsibilities as all peoples living in Canada. And when I got in touch with Doug Tennant, who is the CEO of the organization, and Jillian Glennie, who is the involvement coordinator at the Semiahmoo House, they identified two self-advocates who were active in their own civic engagement program and attended the dialogues with them. They shared with us that oftentimes it is hard for the self-advocates to have a voice in such engagements, and we as a conveners lack the expertise or capacity to provide support. So they suggested that Doug and Jillian would attend and provide the support the self-advocates needed to take full part in the discussions. The key here was finding people who don't necessarily have the usual titles and also creating a very low barrier entry for participation. Sometimes that simply means allowing more people to attend from the same organization and allocating more seats for those who need extra support. After the initial process of 4 focus groups, a dialogue with national and international policy experts at the Open Government Summit, a regional workshop that brought together everyone, we wrote our first version of the report. We were so excited, so we presented our report to our community of practitioners. And to our surprise, we received a strong pushback. And we were really disappointed because we were so excited that this phase was over and we were ready to present the outcomes to everybody. And I saw myself become slightly uncomfortable. I thought, hey, like we did our homework, like what did we not do? And we found out that one of the biggest feedback was on the fact that we were not explicit on the Indigenous engagement and the specific needs that that community has, and the fact that there needs to be more explicitity around the systemic inequity. We had originally made the decision to include and embed Indigenous perspectives in each of the sessions, and the Indigenous perspectives were woven through each principle rather than being an exclusive one, because we believed that it was important that the Indigenous perspectives were reflected in all the discussions we had. And in this initial feedback phase, we also heard loud and clear that people really wanted to go beyond inclusion. Inclusion wasn't enough. So after internal deliberation, we decided that there was a strong value in further recognizing the specific rights of the Indigenous peoples and pivoted to host an additional roundtable with just the Indigenous practitioners. We also went back to the drawing board and reframed the overall project question so that we wouldn't be shying away from saying bold things. So for instance, the name of the whole document changed from the inclusive public engagement to beyond inclusion, equity in public engagement. At the end, it only made our research richer. My colleague Nicole will go deeper into the details of how this influenced our overall framework and the principles. I really wanted to share with you this story because I wanted to reiterate my point of there not being one right approach for inclusion. No matter how much you do your homework, there will always be room for improvement. And sometimes it's simple as just picking up your phone and asking those who you're trying to engage. We learned through this process that the important thing is not getting it perfect, but you're making room for feedback and are ready to pivot your project, even if it's after your report is written. And also that it is important to solicit diverse point of views when creating your process and not make a mistake of believing that you have checked a box just because you've consulted one expert. The principles that you will see in a minute might not be surprising at all, and sometimes actually sound quite obvious. We went into the process thinking that we might find new things about inclusion, but at the end, the process really confirmed that there's not a perfect answer for doing inclusive or equitable engagement work, and that we just need to create more space for it and practice doing it better. It's more about learning to ask better questions and thriving in that uncomfortable space of not knowing. As we headed into this engagement, there was one thing that we kept repeating over and over again, and it was the fact that this is only the first phase of the larger process, and by no means we will pretend to know the answer of how to do inclusive engagement. So we will be continuing to make edits to this resource. So I'd like to ask you to keep us accountable and give us any feedback or questions you have about the document so we can continue to develop our thinking in this topic. I also want to say that we also believe that case study is one of the most effective ways to share knowledge and further this practice. So in this report, you'll also see a few case studies attached to each principle. We will be continuing to collect more case studies. So if you are a practitioner listening today and have good examples of how these principles were applied to your work, we would love to hear from you. So with that, I'll turn it back to Elodie and we will get into the principles.
Thanks, Grace. Oh. Going on. So before we dive into the content itself, I'm kind of making you sit there and tease you a little bit with this. I thought we could try to find out who was in the room today. So Sabrina, could you put up your the first poll to try and figure out where you all work, in what area? And you can choose multiple things because I know a lot of you wear several hats. Oh, lots of people in public institutions and government, quite a few in academic, some in nonprofit, some students. It's amazing the diversity of people here. Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes for the last people to enter their answer. Maybe you're like me and you don't really know where you belong. That's okay. Great, well, thanks for letting us know. We love knowing who's in the room. Perfect. Can you share the results, Sabrina? Maybe we could put this up. Wonderful. So 56% from public institutions and government. That's big. So we're quite happy to have you all here. So I'm going to ask Nicole to quickly give us an overview of how we got to an approach that was about principles and not a blueprint for how to do this. And once she's done that, we'll take a short break and then Nicole will dive into the actual principles themselves and the content. So maybe if we could close the poll, Sabrina, and I will now introduce Nicole Armos. So Nicole Armos is our Senior Research Associate here at the Center in the Office of Knowledge and Practice. She's also the main writer of this report. And I can tell you there have been many, many hours of sweat, tears, and laughter that went into writing this report. So Nicole deserves a big hand for the work that she's poured into this. And I will now give her the mic so she can take us through how we came to working on principles.
Thanks, Elodie. Lovely to see so many participants today. Yes, as Grace was describing, our initial period of research, after that initial period of research of a literature review, the focus groups and roundtables really helped to expand our understanding of inclusion and equity. And one of the things that really stood out to me in our conversations was that there were kind of multiple definitions, multiple dimensions of the meaning of inclusion and equity when we were speaking of these themes. The most immediately apparent is what we're often trying to evaluate in our processes, the diversity of participants and how accessible the space or the process was. But participants were also talking about, for instance, whether decision makers truly were committed to including public input in their decision-making processes, and also the importance of systemic equity within institutions and society. So this includes how representatively diverse our staff and our decision makers are, and the degree of social equality within a community. As one participant said, it's nice to have freedom of expression, but if you don't have access to clean water or food, there can be no adequate participation. So while many of the original principles that we had drafted were validated through this process, that's how we were encouraged to consider how public engagement practice itself can be impacting those larger spheres of equity. And we added two new principles, which I'll discuss in a minute, that more explicitly address that systemic level, including a distinct principle related to our relationship with Indigenous peoples in a colonial context, and a call to advance systemic equity. And as Elodie mentioned, we chose to move into a principles-based approach because one of the overwhelming things we were hearing was that inclusion and equity, it's extremely context dependent. It depends on what community you have, what the topic of your engagement is, how much time and resources you have available. So the way it looks on the ground can look so very different in different projects, and there isn't a very clear checklist that we can give saying, if you do these three things, you're going to be inclusive and equitable. And rather, a principles-based approach is saying, okay, what are the core values that we want to uphold in this process, and how can we keep those in mind throughout the planning, the implementation, as well as after the engagement is done. So I think, Elodie, you're mentioning there's a second poll, and then giving us a little bit of a break, and then I'll dive into describing the principles.
Yes, so one question we wanted to ask you, because of course, as people who spend a lot of time listening to other folks, we're always interested in what your take is on these things. And one of the questions we had for you is what are some of the main challenges that you find in your practice in terms of thinking about equity and inclusion in public engagement? So I think we're going to put a second poll up, Sabrina, and we did put a few things that came up in our research here. Obviously, there may be more things, so feel free to share some of the additional questions that you may have in the chat box. But here are some of the things that we heard from different groups. And I hope everybody is able to see the poll this time around. If you can't see it, you can just tag Sabrina in the chat and she'll be able to help you out. Lovely, it seems like everybody can see it. Wonderful. So I'm guessing that in this time of COVID, a lot of us are also dealing with the aspect of having to move a lot of engagement online. And I see that digital divide and online accessibility and literacy is high on people's list. This is something that we've seen come out of a lot of recent discussions with different practitioners. Yes, somebody mentioned the resource of time to invest in relationship building and trust building. That was definitely a big thing that came up in our research as well. Blind spots and unconscious bias, systematic apathy, trust building. These are amazing. Thank you for sharing these with us. Authenticity of engagement, capacity and staff resources, absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these when we get to the principles, but I did want to give an opportunity for everybody to grab an extra coffee, an extra tea, or to just pop their head out of the window and get some fresh air before we dive into the real nitty-gritty parts of this content. So we're going to end the poll here, and maybe if Sabrina can put the results up while we're taking our quick little break. And I'm going to mute myself. I think we're going to turn off our videos for a few seconds. So it is on my clock here, 10:59. If we could reconvene at 11:04, and Nicole will dive right in to the content for us. So have a good little quick coffee break. Okay, it's 11:04, so we're going to get started again as I guess people start coming back with their new cup of tea and maybe a snack and hopefully a breath of quick fresh air, as I hope many of you are not spending too much time sitting in front of a screen every day. So as we can see on the poll results, one of the biggest challenges about inclusion and equity in public engagement is drawing a representatively diverse group. And I think this is something we've also found in our practice, in our research. Digital divide and online accessibility and literacy is another one, and consultation fatigue in over-consulted communities. This is something I think we're becoming more and more aware of, and something that has been on our minds ourselves as practitioners as we go into certain communities and realize that maybe this community has been through 10 different consultations or engagements in the last 6 months. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Nicole to dive right into the principles that we developed through this research. And I think we can take the poll down, Sabrina. And Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thanks again, Elodie. Yeah, so I'll dive in right away with the first principle, which actually speaks to something that I was seeing pop up in the chat in terms of trust and accountability, because the first principle is to invite participation within an authentic and accountable engagement process. 3 of the top values that we were hearing participants emphasize in the focus groups was authenticity, accountability, and transparency to rebuild the public's trust in engagement processes. Even in the most accessible, expansive engagement process, in order to draw participation in the first place, the public needs to know that their contributions will make a difference. And this principle is particularly important to keep in mind when we're engaging historically marginalized communities who, for various reasons, legal systems of oppression as well as social systems of oppression, have been left out of decision-making processes, or when trust has been eroded, maybe because of a previous bad experience with an engagement process. We heard that authentic and accountable engagement doesn't have predetermined outcomes or expected conclusions, and decision makers are genuinely interested in the public's input and are responsive to what they hear. So we can demonstrate this authenticity and accountability by clarifying and communicating our objectives. If we flip to the next slide, there's a tool, for instance, from the International Association for Public Participation, their spectrum of engagement, which helps us to clarify whether the goal of engaging the public is to inform or to really co-create solutions, or something in between. And there isn't, a good side or a bad side to the spectrum, but it's important for us to identify where we feel we stand on this, and where the decision makers feel they stand on the spectrum, and then communicate that very clearly to the public. Maybe we are only hearing some ideas, or maybe we are really going to be empowering the community to co-create the solutions, or maybe we just want to inform them about things that we are planning in the future. During this COVID-19 crisis, we're hearing it's especially important right now to do this process of clarifying our objectives, because we're competing with multiple demands on people's time and energy. And it's really important to consider critically whether this is even the best time to engage certain communities who are experiencing additional burdens. It's not a discouragement to engaging, but a call to do so in a very careful manner. Other things that we can do to demonstrate authenticity and accountability, researching previous engagements. We heard that over-consultation can be an issue as well. People get tired of if they're receiving a lot of demands for consultation. So we may be wanting to check out what other folks are doing, what questions have been asked recently, avoiding duplication, and really making that transparent to the public as well, saying, we heard that you've been talking about this, but now we want to dive deeper on this particular aspect of that, maybe. Reporting back findings in a timely way, especially for things that have long-term impacts, reporting that periodically down the road. Maybe there's multiple stages to implementation. Maybe implementation will take 5 years, 10 years, but having folks know that, we're going to get to implementing your recommendations, it just won't happen right away. and finding different ways to report back as well. Especially now with digital tools, we can do a webinar, we can do a report, having things that are accessible for Braille or screen readers or different accessibility needs, so that folks who participate can really access the final findings. And when possible, involving the communities in monitoring and implementing findings. Maybe there's an advisory group we can set up, or some kind of task force that can actually be on the ground helping to put these things into place. So the more that the community is involved in seeing that accountability, the more they're going to really feel it and trust future engagement processes. Principle 2 calls us to plan early and proactively. We need to design the entire engagement plan with the aim of maximizing inclusion and equity, including the budgets, the timelines, the framing, the communications, the process design. As one participant said, diversity shouldn't be an afterthought. It requires careful planning, research, and critical thinking in order to identify and address gaps early on. So we should also be aiming to anticipate and address problems or barriers before they discourage participants from joining or forcing people to advocate for themselves. So if you are, for instance, planning to include some accessibility measures such as ASL, live captioning for an online engagement, maybe you have gender accessible washrooms or travel bursaries are available, make sure that's really clearly communicated in your advertisement, because that can get people really excited to join in. Or if you are preferring to wait and see which accessibility measures will be most needed, you might want to include a question in the registration process, asking people, do you need ASL? Do you need, what can help make this accessible for you, so that folks see that you are thinking through that process and willing to include certain measures on a case-by-case basis or on a needs basis. A proactive approach, of course, involves dedicating time to building relationships and to conducting sufficient outreach and allocating resources for these accessibility measures. Now we hear that unfortunately time and resources are some of the biggest barriers practitioners face to designing inclusive engagement processes. And we know that folks are often operating under limited budgets. We're trying to be really efficient with our engagement so that we can focus our resources on implementation and the action side. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that rushed or under-resourced engagement can cause more harm than good. So we need to critically assess those budgets and timelines and be realistic about our objectives. And maybe there's some necessary trade-offs. Maybe not everything can be achieved right away, or maybe tapping into certain community resources that can provide that accessibility without it necessarily costing a lot. Now, the third principle of establishing respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples was designed primarily for a Canadian context in recognition of Indigenous peoples' ancestral ties to these lands and their inherent treaty, constitutional, and human rights. However, we invite those of you who are joining us from outside of Canada to explore how this principle can apply to your context, especially if you are in another settler colonial states, such as in North or South America, in the Caribbean, or in Australasia. Now, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has affirmed that Indigenous peoples hold an inherent right to self-determination, and that the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples is required before the approval of legislation or projects affecting their rights, their lands, or other resources. And additionally, in Canada, governments have a legal duty to consult Indigenous peoples around decisions that may affect their Aboriginal or treaty rights. We realized that this was beyond the scope of our work in this project to comment on how to fulfill the legal duty to consult. But we also realized that all engagement practitioners hold a responsibility to work in a spirit of reconciliation in all of our engagement processes, whether we are specifically engaging Indigenous peoples, or if we are engaging the broader community or other ethnic communities on ancestral Indigenous territories. So we can enact this responsibility in different ways, including familiarizing ourselves with the land, history, culture, protocols, and the governance structures of Indigenous communities on whose territories we are working. We should be making time to build trusting personal relationships with Indigenous communities, ceding power and space for Indigenous people to lead engagements as organizers and facilitators. So for instance, here at the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue, when we are working on engagements on Indigenous topics, we're often in a role of supporting and providing administrative support and having Indigenous people actually lead the engagement. Prioritizing reciprocity. One participant, I remember, really said that colonialism has a history of taking from Indigenous communities. And so it's important to ensure that our engagement processes are supporting the Indigenous communities' economic, social, and cultural well-being, such as by hiring local vendors or by honoring and centering Indigenous knowledge and worldviews in our engagement processes. And lastly, we can help to build public awareness of Indigenous rights and the impacts of colonialism in relation to the topic of the engagement, whether that's housing or service centers or anything we are engaging on. There's always an intersection with Indigenous rights and well-being. So we would provide more details and resources and examples for how to enact this principle in our guide. And we're also working on an international version of our guide, which may modify this principle a little bit so that it can adapt to international contexts that don't fall under, for instance, the duty to consult and so on. The fourth principle is to engage the internal diversity of a community. So this one is a bit of a mouthful. Basically what it means is that we often map different communities we want to engage, like youth or women or newcomer Canadians. However, these identities are not fixed or isolated. They intersect and they affect one another and our experience of the world. For example, my experience as a young Mexican woman will be different than that of an older Mexican man, or a Mexican person with a disability, or a trans woman from Mexico, even though we share the same ethnicity. So applying an intersectional approach to engagement means that we take these differences into account in order to hear from diverse members of a community. When we're designing an engagement, it's important to develop a strategic plan for recruitment. First, by identifying which demographics are the most relevant for this particular topic, because no two engagements are going to look the same. Of course, we want to have general gender diversity, age diversity, etc. But for particular topics, certain demographics may rise to the top. For example, if we are engaging, doing an engagement to design a queer community center, it would be important to ensure that there's really good representation of different identities within that community. Whereas for an engagement on housing that we conducted last year here at the center, it was really important for us to ensure that we were mapping out where folks were within the city using their postal codes, and also to hear from renters, owners, and landlords and people living in different types of housing, so that we were getting the perspectives of everyone who was living in the community. So you may want to set a baseline goal for representation for those key demographics based on figures such as the census. Although being mindful that certain marginalized communities are sometimes underrepresented in the census, so there may be other data points that you can draw from. And over the course of an engagement, monitoring those gaps, checking registration numbers, asking participants and partners, who's missing from the room? Who else do we need to include? Whose voice is really important here. And when we're reporting those findings, we can still practice this intersectional approach by disaggregating the data. So that means by highlighting the differences in perspectives between different communities, maybe through using a survey so that we can really visualize if there was a big difference in opinion between seniors and youth, or between men and women, and so on. If we go to the next slide, practitioners in Canada may also be familiar with the Gender-Based Analysis Plus, GBA Plus framework, where this image is from, which has been adopted by the federal government to explore how intersecting identities impact programs and policies that they develop. And GBA Plus encourages us to conduct further research and challenge our assumptions on how different participants may be affected differently in an engagement process. So if you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of online resources for GBA Plus, which can help to enact this principle. And we include those links in the guide as well. Principle 5 emphasizes the importance of working in reciprocal relationship with communities. In our focus groups, we heard that trusting, respectful, and collaborative relationships are the foundation of equitable public engagement. It's important to take time to build trust and genuine relationships with community members and organizations before approaching them with an engagement, and to sustain these relationships between projects so that we can develop trust and foster further opportunities for collaboration. Partnering with community organizations to co-create engagements is also very effective. They have a deep knowledge of the community, and they have established networks that can support the planning, they can broaden outreach, and it can lend credibility to the engagement process. Community members are also often better placed to lead the outreach and facilitation because they are known by the folks in their community. They are a familiar phrase and may just draw more participation that way. Participants also emphasize that these relationships should be reciprocal. We should be asking community about their needs and priorities to ensure that the process and outcomes benefit the community in concrete ways, such as maybe it's offering honoraria or building capacity for youth to be facilitators, maybe hiring local vendors to support the economic well-being of a community, or offering a space within the engagement for community networking. One of the things we often hear at the end of our engagements is that the highlight for folks was getting to meet other folks in their community who are doing similar work or who are also passionate about this topic. And so the more we can build in maybe a half-hour coffee break networking, for instance, that could really give something back that's really concrete to the community and help them move this forward in different ways at a grassroots level. Principle 6 focuses on tailoring engagement plans to the context. So as Grace mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to inclusion, and accessibility needs may vary over time between individuals and communities. So it's important to co-create that engagement with community partners and ask people what they need, maybe through registration processes, or even just in the room, you know, at the start of an engagement process, checking in with folks if they have everything they need. Remaining flexible to changing plans. Things emerge all the time when we're doing engagement. We know that very well. And so the more we have a little bit of extra, maybe money allocated in the budget for a little bit of cushioning, or just someone on the staff who is able to address things right away. And offering diverse ways of getting involved. So maybe combining online and in person, having multiple dates and times, or different ways of expressing ideas. Some people are very keen on expressing themselves verbally. Some people prefer to write. Some people might be into arts-based engagements. Right now, for example, we're hearing, of course, a lot of questions of how do we engage online because of the social distancing restrictions. A lot of our projects are moving online, but we also have to consider the needs of folks who are, you know, have less access to technology or are less familiar with platforms and how to navigate them. So we might want to add in some analog options. We might still use mail outs through snail mail. We might use telephone surveys or phone trees and texting and so on, just so that we have more options. And we actually just released a tip sheet with some of the strategies and other options that we've heard for online engagement right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we can send to you after the webinar. Principle 7, we're nearing the end, asks us to commit to ongoing learning and improvement at an individual and organizational level. So we can develop a baseline understanding of what inclusion and equity looks like, and then build capacity over time by engaging in reflection, evaluation, and ongoing professional development. So at the back of our guide, you will see that we've included a list of, just a starting list of some recommended trainings, resources that we thought were particularly useful from our literature review. And this principle also acknowledges that making mistakes is inevitable, but it is important to be transparent about our shortcomings and to propose a plan in a timely manner to address issues in consultation with community members themselves, asking them, okay, what would be a good way of addressing this issue? And also important to build communities of practice, as we are doing through webinars such as this, where we can learn together by transparently sharing our challenges and successes, by sharing case studies of good work, asking questions from one another, so that ideally that learning happens, behind the scenes and not at the expense of the communities themselves. And then the final principle, one of the new ones that we added when we revised and refined the principles, is to advance systemic equity. And this loops back to that idea that inclusion on the ground in our engagement processes is affected by the level of equality in our societies as a whole. So it's important to recognize the way power, privilege, and systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, ableism, impact our engagement processes and institutions, and to find ways to advance systemic equity within our roles, which are very different depending where you're joining us from or where you're working. But we might establish, for instance, equitable hiring practices and workplace cultures, doing some internal analysis so that we can recruit and retain more diverse staff in the engagement field. Embedding inclusive and accessible practices in our formal policies. For instance, including diverse genders in registration forms in a really formal way, or setting up gender neutral bathrooms or accessible bathrooms. Sharing power with communities in order to challenge that traditional hierarchy between decision makers or engagement staff and the public. So the more we're able to do things in a co-creative manner with communities, the better. And also welcoming innovations to traditional engagement processes, because traditional engagement was designed by and for dominant groups. And so we need those innovations in order to reach diverse voices. Now, of course, your community may identify additional values or principles that are important to equity in your context. And our understanding of these concepts are changing day to day. So this is not a static or prescriptive list, but rather an invitation or provocation for ongoing conversation. And on that note, I'll turn it back to Elodie to open the space for questions.
Before we get to the questions, I wanted to bring back these learnings to a wider context. Here at the Morris J. Wass Center for Dialogue, we're also very interested in how we help sustain and promote resilience in democracy. And one of the learnings that came out of all the research we did on democracy resilience was that the sense of belonging is really, really important. And for us, all this work we did on equity and inclusion was to try to respond to the fact that many of our communities do not feel like they belong. They don't feel like they belong in decision-making processes, and they don't feel like they belong in engagement processes. It gives people a sense that they don't have that much of an agency in decisions that are going to affect their lives. So I think for us, what was really important about this reflection around equity and inclusion was, how do we give communities that sense of agency back? How do we make them feel like they belong into our wider society, into our systems, into our democracy? Because as we're seeing right now, attacks on democracy are coming from all sides. We all play a part in helping that resilience keep us as unified as possible in the face of these threats. So really emphasizing how we can be authentic, accountable, and how we really foster that sense of belonging for all communities that are part of this country. That's something I think that was really, really crucial to us. The other thing that was a really deep learning for us is how much this work means working on ourselves and questioning our own beliefs, our own biases, our own shortcomings as practitioners. And, we all have them. It's not an easy process, and it's not an easy conversation to engage in. And I was struck by a conversation with some colleagues at the International Association of Public Participation around how difficult these conversations can be to bring into your institutions or your government. No one wants to admit we're not equitable. No one wants to admit that we actually uphold certain systems of oppression for communities. So I think what's important is to continue to create communities where we can share and we can really be a little bit vulnerable with the fact that this is hard. This is hard, but at the same time, we have to recognize that it's even harder for the communities who don't have that agency, who don't have that sense of belonging, and who are being left out. So I think almost as practitioners, we have a sense of duty to continue to promote this work and push it forward. However hard and, you know, uncomfortable it is for us, I think we can allow ourselves to sit in a little bit of discomfort to ensure that, in effect, our democracy will remain resilient. So with that, I am going to open it to questions now. So there are a great many of you here with us. So we're going to try to get through questions using the question and answer function of Zoom. But at the end, I will try to open it up so people can actually speak and we can actually see your faces and hear your voices. Because I know for myself and many others, it's becoming hard not to actually interact with people in real life. So we're going to try to do that. So if you want to go ahead and open the question and answer function in Zoom, you can start typing in your questions and I will try to moderate them to our different panelists here. So go ahead. The questions are open. And I'm going to take the slides down so that we can see ourselves a little bit better.
I did know there was a question in the chat box already talking about the term of representatively and whether that suggests some kind of election process. So I might just jump in here to answer that. Just in terms of the terminology, we used representative to mean that ideally the folks in the room will look like a representative sample or will, as you say, reflect the kind of demographics in the community that you're trying to engage. So, you know, ideally our elected officials would also be fully representative of that diversity. Sometimes they're not. More men than women, more white people than people of color, and so on. But as much as with our elected officials, we're hoping folks in the room will represent that demographic.
We have another question from Leonora asking, how are the current global pandemic and likely post-pandemic scenarios going to affect diversity and inclusive participation? That's a tough one, Leonora. I'm not sure we know how to answer that because things are evolving so quickly. But one thing that is emerging right now, I think in a lot of the conversations that we're having with practitioners, is that there is a form of communities closing up onto themselves to protect themselves and also because they feel unsafe in certain circumstances. A good example of that is right now here in the Lower Mainland in BC, there has been an uptick in racist incidents against people who present as Asian. And that has affected these communities quite strongly, and they do not feel safe engaging right now. And it's also affecting other folks. So just as an anecdote, 2 people who are of Indigenous descent here were recently attacked because they were thought to be Asian. And this has created, again, a sense of unease and a sense from the Indigenous communities as well that they might be targeted again. So I think we need to take that into account in how we create safety for participants and how we try to create a sense that we can still engage, we can still discuss, but we need to have really clear guidelines on what that means. And that may mean sometimes being very, very explicit about what will be allowed and what will not be allowed in terms of language, in terms of behavior, especially behavior targeting folks that identify in different ways. So people of color, Indigenous folks, Black folks, people from the LGBTQ2S community, and others, many, many others, because I think the targeting is not just racialized right now, it's happening at all sorts of different levels. Second question that I can see here, what criteria might you suggest for evaluating the equity of an engagement beyond tracking the demographics of participants? So I'm going to pass that question on to Nicole because Nicole also happens to be a bit of an evaluation nerd.
Yes, actually, one of our long-term goals with this work is to create some kind of an evaluation framework that we could share with folks, but it is something that we are trying to figure out ourselves, because when we did realize that there were, different dimensions or layers as we were showing in those concentric circles, of understanding inclusion, it made us really rethink that we were doing our evaluation. Some of the ones that come to mind based on the principles, though, for instance, maybe we could track the community benefit. Was the engagement really reciprocal? What were some of the positive outcomes for the community beyond, just being there for your engagement? Also, community leadership, staff diversity. How diverse was your staff, or did you include, facilitators, note takers, or organizers who were from the communities you were engaging? Also, to loop back and evaluate that first principle of authenticity and accountability, maybe having some kind of way to evaluate the implementation, the monitoring system, having a way to report back to communities to what degree their input impacted the decision, where that decision-making process continued afterwards. So these are just some ideas, but I think that's definitely something we're hoping to co-create with all of you, and in the coming years, and figure out different ways that evaluation can look.
Dorothy is saying that we cannot assume that just because there is hatred being directed at Asians, the hatreds of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color are ongoing. It may be more intense during this COVID time. Yes, absolutely. And I think there is a crystallization of hate speech, of other acts of violence against folks. And that's something that needs to be thought through when we do engagement. So also having contingency plans in terms of ensuring safety for participants, that's something that needs to be thought through. And again, that can be done really in close collaboration with different communities, and asking for their input on how do we ensure safety for all in this context. And I think, again, that means sometimes taking a little more time, not rushing into an engagement, and really doing that homework of asking those really important questions up front, especially if you have good relationships with your community partners. They can be really key in helping ensure that safety across the board. The concepts of agency and ethnicity, I think this goes beyond the conversation today, but it would be interesting to unpack some of those premises behind the words concepts. That's a question from Jerry. So again, maybe I'll ask Nicole. Nicole, do you want to unpack some of those concepts?
That's a big ask. I think, well, Jerry, you're bringing up a really good point there, that you're saying it seems like the premise is that there's a sense of agency out there, and I see that most people fear they do not have any impact on policies or processes or laws. And so that is something we are noticing. The Center of Dialogue is also conducting research on strengthening Canadian democracy, including the degree to which people trust institutions and the degree of agency that they are feeling. And those numbers are not always as positive as we would like them to be. We conducted a national poll last year that we can link to in the follow-up from the webinar. But there is definitely a sense that some folks out there don't feel like they would have much of a say in a process. It affects their degree of wanting to be there in the room. It affects also sometimes their degree of capacity. I think that was, I guess another layer of the inclusion and equity that we could include in those concentric circles is making sure that folks have a sense of capacity, of knowing how to navigate an engagement process. For instance, if you are in a town hall system, a very traditional system of engagement, some people may not know where they're supposed to interact, how it's supposed to go. They may never have been in one. They might not feel like they have a voice. And this is something that speaks very near and dear to my heart, because I remember my own parents participating in an engagement process that I was co-leading as a student, and them saying, wow, this is the first time I felt I had a say. And I think it comes down to making everything really transparent, making things very approachable, and not assuming that people know how to do it or know that they are really valued. So the more we are really friendly, approachable, person-to-person interactions are just key. But I think that agency piece, and the more we research how to build that sense of trust and capacity, it'll help increase inclusion and equity in all our engagement processes.
So I see we have two raised hands. So I think we have Asma Namanji and Dawn. So maybe Asma Namanji, if you want to unmute yourself, and we'll give you the mic. Okay, you should be able to speak now. Sabrina, can you help us give the mic? Okay, we seem to be having some technical issues. So maybe let's go to Dawn, and then we'll come back to our person right after. Dawn, go ahead. I see we have Asma Namanji back online. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I must have just accidentally pressed it. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so we'll go to Dawn next. Dawn, the floor is yours. Okay, we seem to have lost Dawn as well. I think we might be running into some technical issues here. So maybe what I'll do is I'll go back to some of the questions in the Q&A. A person asked, can you provide some specific examples or strategies for how engagement can address power inequities and imbalances in decision-making processes? How can we ensure that conveners cede power to community members? That's a really good question. And maybe I can ask Grace to jump in on that one, because she might be able to provide some examples of how we've actually done that. Grace, do you want to come in on this?
Yes, that's a big question. Specific examples or strategies for how engagement can address power inequities and imbalances in decision-making process. I'm not really sure if I can think of anything on top of my head. Do you have anything, Elodie, that you want to jump in first?
Well, I think, again, working in partnership is one of the ways you can do that. So instead of having a top-down approach to engagement, co-creating engagement with communities is one way to do this. And that can look as simple as partnering, again, with a community partner, developing the process with the community partners, or having members of that specific community conduct the engagement as facilitators or even as process designers. And one really good example I can think of is the city of Seattle a couple of years back did a lot of engagement around transportation. And they wanted to reach specific communities, particularly the Vietnamese speaking community. And because the specific route was supposed to go through that community. And what they did is they really worked with their community partners in that specific community, and the community partners helped develop the engagement themselves. And that was one of their most successful engagement when they were doing this update to their transportation plan. So again, thinking about how we can work in partnership and ways in which we can maybe support some community groups. Again, that may mean a little bit more budget to help them conduct these engagements. And conveners can definitely cede power sometimes by also giving them the ability to run pieces of the engagement. So it does mean taking a risk. And I realize it's, again, very uncomfortable because we like to hold our processes very close to our hearts. But in some cases, taking a risk and having a bit of faith in the partner to do this with us can be extremely valuable. So that's one example. Somebody else is asking if there isn't time or buy-in from leadership to fully develop the 8 principles outlined. Do you feel some engagement, even if it can be perceived as token, better than no engagement? Yes. And I want to stress that these 8 principles, we do not expect everybody to implement all of them. We know this is going to be an ongoing learning process. And even if you can get to 2 or 3 of them, that's amazing. That's already better than nothing. So I think whatever you can do that will start opening the door up a little bit more, that will start thinking about equity a little bit more, that is always so valuable. It's always better than nothing. So I would say, please, whatever you can do at at your level with your organization's means and abilities, please try it out. And then if you can find times where you can pilot a new way of doing something, a trial, take a chance. You might be surprised at how well received it will be by your decision makers.
I just want to,
Grace, go ahead.
I just want to quickly add that the relationship piece comes in really useful in these times. If you already have a really meaningful relationship on a personal level built with community, even if the engagement that you're running feels tokenized at times, it's the relationship that will continue to the next engagement. It's not just going to be a project. Like, relationship is something that lasts beyond projects, and that will maybe very gradually turn your token engagement into something that's more meaningful. And that open communication of being able to ask what is meaningful for people who are being engaged, I think would be really useful in that.
That's a really good point, Grace. And I think, again, when we were stressing that reciprocity in the relationship, we often joke in the office that we have the 100 cups of tea practice. A lot of our time is spent reconnecting on a regular basis with some of our partners, some of the communities that we engage with regularly. And it doesn't need to be transactional. And I think when we think about equity, moving a little bit away from that transactional aspect of things is really key. When we maintain those relationships on the long term, that's where a lot of results come from. And I know there are a number of municipalities and governments who have sort of embedded those community partners in their institution in a way that they can continue to have those relationships on the long term. And that's where they see a lot of good results. So I cannot stress enough this practice of 100 cups of tea. And it may be, you know, right now that we have to do them virtually, but checking in on a regular basis with those communities, just asking how things are without needing to have an outcome coming out of it. That's key, again, to that authenticity and that meaningfulness of the relationship. I cannot stress that enough. We have another question about how can we best include flexibility, shifting context, and changing technology use in these overarching guiding principles for evaluation. Again, I think the principle of ongoing learning is a really good one because it also means ongoing testing in a sense. So today, in the midst of this pandemic, maybe we're testing out some new technology like Zoom or other platforms that many of our partners are using right now that are quite amazing. But maybe we're also going back to testing some old technologies. Like Nicole mentioned, I know there's a revival of telephone trees happening right now, telephone town halls, snail mail surveys going out. There are multiple ways in which you can test things that have already been used in the past and that were quite successful, or test something completely new. And I think also giving ourselves permission to try things out. And again, these can be pilots. You don't have to test your entire big engagement with these new things, but maybe you test a small piece of it. Let's try this out. Let's try to reach out to this particular community with a telephone tree and see what happens. So I think it's, again, on learning, testing, monitoring how it went, and evaluating it, and then keep that loop going. That's really, really key, I think. And that's what we're going to be doing with this document as well. It's already been through quite a number of revisions. It was peer reviewed, but as we go through this process, what we're hoping is that other people are going to try these out and then give us feedback. We really want you to send us an email and say, hey, I tried this out, and you know, maybe it worked or maybe it didn't work, but we want to hear back from you, and we want to also showcase some of your case studies. So as a companion piece to this document that is coming out, there will also be a case study book. And in the meantime, what we'll roll out is a series of articles on our website showcasing, you know, things that people have tried out and where it worked, but also for those of you who are willing to feel a little bit vulnerable, where it didn't work. where we failed, because I think there's a lot to be learned from our failures as well as from our successes. So we're hoping that as a community, you can help us do that. And we really want to shine a spotlight because we know many of you are actually pushing this forward in really great ways and maybe not getting a lot of kudos for it. So we want to be your pom-pom girls here in the back and really showcase your work in a good way and get it out there, because I think it's sometimes also convincing our decision makers. It's easier to convince them if we can show them how it's been done somewhere else and say, hey, look, it wasn't actually that hard to do this. So I really want to encourage all of you to really do that. Yeah, to share with us your successes and your failures and how you're trying to implement these principles, because as Nicole and Grace said, a lot of them are not new, they're not rocket science, they're, you know, common sense principles, but the applications, the concrete ways in which we find ways to apply them, I think that's going to really be the interesting piece in the months to come, particularly in light of what is happening with the pandemic. So I'm going to just check if there are any more questions coming up here. How do we envision liberation in going beyond inclusion? Are you meaningfully listening to what marginalized people, especially Black and Indigenous people, Indigenous folks are saying about this? Yes, that is a very good question. And I think this is why we decided we needed to talk about this as being beyond inclusion, about this being about equity. And if you remember those concentric circles we showed at some point, engagement is one piece of that, but overall social equity is the ultimate goal of this. And one way I like to think about it, and if I may borrow the words of an author that I really love, Robin Wall Kimmerer, I like to think about this as a practice of restorative reciprocity. How can we bring restorative reciprocity in our practice? And how can we make engagement a real tool for liberation? And I think that's a huge question. I don't think we've solved it yet, but as a person of color myself, I want to make sure that stays forefront on our agenda and that we're going to keep pushing that forward. I also want to mention that at the center, we're very lucky to have a very brilliant fellow, Ginger Gosnell-Myers, who is our Indigenous fellow, and she's also very passionate about this. So I think as a team ourselves, we're committed to liberation and to continuing to push this forward. It's not always easy to convince decision makers of this, but we will keep at it. And we hope all of you are also going to be a part of this and help us move this agenda forward. What if you can't deliver on engagement input? For example, the ask is not feasible or within the scope of the project. That's an excellent question, and that is a big issue for a lot of projects. I want to say again, what Nicole mentioned around the first principle about being very clear about your objectives and the frame. Don't go asking a question that you're not going to like the answer to. I would say really frame your questions properly. If you can't commit to implementing what was recommended, then be honest about it and give the rationale behind it. So again, if you're working with a community, but you're gathering input from also experts, other folks, there are other pieces of information that are going to come into the final decision. Be honest about it. Be very clear right at the front end about that and say, we're gathering input from all these different people and we're going to make a decision at the end, but we will communicate to you what that decision is. Again, if you think about simple engagements like where are we going to put the next park or the next street light in our municipality, you know, maybe your community has really clear ideas about that, but your experts that work on the engineering part of the town are going to tell you, well, that's a really nice idea, but it's absolutely not feasible. Well, you have to communicate that. We loved your idea, but here's why it's not feasible. Again, it's about being open and communicating. So that's really, really important.
Jump in there with one, as someone who's been doing a lot of reporting for the engagement projects that we do, I also find that sometimes you can extract the core value that is underpinning the the recommendation, and you can report back on that, and you can include that within the action. Even if, you know, maybe someone had a big dream for what their park could look like, and it's not something that is feasible with the resources that you have, but maybe there's like a sense of, oh, folks really want a place to gather and connect, or you know, maybe there's some kind of underlying value or principle that you can report on and include.
Thanks, Nicole, for clarifying that. Jerry's asking how you can communicate with us. Well, here we go. We're putting our names and emails up on the screen, so don't hesitate to contact us. Somebody's also asking when the additional resources are going to be released. So a lot of the resources are in the guide. You can download the guide from our website. We'll encourage you to do that. Please check back in on our website. There will be additional resources coming out in the next few weeks and few months. The international guide will probably come out early in the fall. We're hoping to have that available for you. And in the meantime, we're going to try to send you all an email with a lot of the resources that we already mentioned today. Luna's asking a really important question around timing, and that a lot of organizations ask to have an equity framework built within 3 to 6 months. And she said, they say it's frustrating, so little time is allocated to equitable engagement. How do we get funders and organizations to be more realistic on time needed for engagement? I don't have a good answer to that, except try to bring in community partners or allies, I would say, to help make the case why you need more time. And this will not always be possible. I know we've run into this frequently in our own work as practitioners, where, you know, a client will say, well, I only have 6 months to do this, so this needs to be done within 6 months. So this is the hard part. This is really the hard part. And I think the more conversations we can have, the more examples we can provide of why we need more time and why the results will be so much better if we have that extra 3 months or 4 months. That's going to be key in changing their mind. So I would say, again, if you can find practical examples of what other organizations have done to demonstrate that maybe they didn't do it in 6 months, they did it in 12. And showcase how better the results were compared to maybe another organization who did it in 2 months. I think we have to give rationales for why we need this time. And again, I'm hoping that as we gather more case studies, you'll be able to have access to those and share those with your decision makers. But I agree that that is a big concern, and I'm hoping we can resolve that.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Another quick tip for that. We heard from folks that using the language of the decision maker or the folks that you're working with, maybe it's, you know, using business language and talking about the return on investment and laying it out in money terms. You know, you've invested this much, and what level of outcomes can we actually provide, and sometimes kind of couching those in the terms of the folks who you're talking to.
Somebody was asking if when they get the documents, they can share the resource with their colleagues. Yes, absolutely. All the work we produce is open source, so you can absolutely share it. We're very happy for you to do that. I see here another question around, as the person being engaged, it is the only giving feedback and not creating from the ground up. So how do you ensure co-creation is actually co-creating? So again, that's a tough one. And I think it does require this whole discussion around how you cede power and how you navigate that discomfort that sometimes we have when we have to relinquish a little bit of control. And this is hard. I will admit, even as an individual, you know, I'm a parent, I have 2 kids. Relinquishing power to my kids is extremely difficult. So I can imagine as a practitioner, trying to relinquish control of certain engagements to a community partner can be incredibly hard, because you don't know. There's always a risk associated with that. But again, as we go forward and try to push equity forward, I think we need to be willing to take some of that risk on. And again, you can try to do it in measured ways. maybe do a pilot for something, see how the pilot goes. Is it fully co-created? What was the feedback that you received from the community that you co-created with? Was it positive feedback? Did you need to cede more power? Then you can kind of do it iteratively. So I think we are going to have to take a little bit of an iterative approach with this in different contexts. In some places, it will be very fast to get to co-creation. In other contexts, it will be a little bit slower, and it will need to go step by step. And again, some of it will be dependent on how much your institution or your organization is willing to take a chance and to take a risk with this. So again, no silver bullet for this, but I would say if you can try to pilot some things or showcase other pilots. This is something I heard a lot. We were very honored to be part of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls 2 years ago. And one of the things we heard through that engagement was that there were many, many pilots across the country. And then within 3 years, they disappeared, no funding. And some of them were quite successful. So trying to find ways to unearth those successful pilots that have happened before and show them to your decision maker and say, look, this was done, it was successful, it worked, we should be doing the same. So I think trying to think of those ways to make it a little more easy for your institution to be willing to take that risk. And also maybe finding ways with your co-creating partners to bring some reassurances into the mix. What can the partner bring in as, things they're willing to put on the table to assure you that this is going to work to some extent? So thinking about those things. But again, there's no perfect solution. And I think that ongoing practice of really discussing, testing, evaluating, and reconvening to see, what do we need to do better? That is going to move us forward so much more than, just sitting there and doing nothing.
Really quickly, like going back to that IAP scale of different levels of engagement, really asking yourself and honestly answering like which kind of engagement you're trying to do, I think really helps. And we're repeating this over and over again, but the clarity and honesty at the front end usually really helps in answering the questions after the engagements.
Yeah, and Louise actually made a really good point in the question and answer. She said the risk of ceding control to community partner is it's not much bigger than the risk of not doing it. So I absolutely agree. The risk right now that we're seeing in our research is much greater in not being more equitable in public engagement than it is with trying to control everything. So the more communities are feeling excluded of these processes, the less our overall democracy is resilient. So that's kind of the lens I come at it from, and all the data that we're seeing kind of confirms that right now. So again, I would argue with your decision makers, like there is greater risk in not doing it. Absolutely, Louise. I 100% agree with you on that one. I'm going to try and see if we can give the mic to a couple more people. We're just about at, oh, it's actually 12. So I know you've spent a lot of time with us. So we're going to wrap this up. Again, asking you folks, if you have a chance to email us with your case study, we would love to hear back from you. And please, try this out. Tell us how it goes. We're really excited to see this come to life and into practice. So again, a big thank you to all of you for making time for this. I know you're all very, very, very busy. I also want to give a special thanks to our two ASL interpreters, Sharon and Jen, who made this event a little bit more accessible, and to Leah, who was our CART provider doing the closed caption today. So a big thanks to them. And yeah, we hope to hear from you very soon. So have a great day, everyone, and take care.